Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. Today, we're going to pick up part 2 of Little Blue Book number 354, titled The Absurdities of Christian Science, written by Joseph McCabe. Copyright somewhere in the 20s. So, this is part 2, and let's get into it. Miss Eddy was, of course, absolutely incapable of philosophical reasoning. And there does not seem to be a man or woman in the movement who is. The qualification for leadership in it is the ability to make $1 produce 3. If there were such a person in the movement, he or she would at once realize that if Miss Eddy is right, if there is no matter and God is all in all, you cannot get at the existence of anything beyond your own states of consciousness. Miss Eddy and science and health are mere myths, just like disease and matter. To a snobbish sect like Christian Science, of course, it does not matter that the great truth cuts every root of social idealism. If there is no matter, there is no poverty, no alcohol, no war. But other people see is all these consequences of Miss Eddy's beautiful truth, 1,000 crushing proofs that it is one of the sorest of superstitions. In point of fact, Christian scientists do not believe what they laud as the fundamental principle of the whole revelation. It would follow that there is no Christian Science monitor, no possibility of one, because there is no matter, and no need of one. If it were possible, because what vulgar people like you and me regard as fact of contemporary life, from automobile accidents to revelations, are only fictions. There are no such things as blood and tears and laughter. The pantheism of the movement lands it in just as many absurdities and inconsistencies. Christian Science wants to enlarge its membership and its treasury by embracing even men and women who would remain really Christian. So Miss Eddy gives in her golden book a form of profession of Christian faith which is supposed to be consistent with her fantastic principles. She admits the inspired word of the Bible, which begins with the creation of matter and describes 1,000 years of material events. She calls Christ the Son of God, though he must be identical with him. And she even claims that the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection on a cross which couldn't exist and from a grave which is fiction, severe amongst other things to show the nothingness of matter, the audacity, at least, is sublime. The atonement may be admitted by the Christian Scientist as unfolding man's unity with God through Jesus Christ, the way shower, which is very much the same as if you defined a butcher as a man who puts French polish on piano legs. And then, when we have learned that we are one with God, necessarily on her principles, we find that we can sin against God and have to be saved. It is a nightmare of verbiage. The only thing that surprises one is that even in this creed of Christian Science Christianity, Mrs. Eddy had not the courage to say that she believed in the incarnation, which is the essence of Christianity. The contortions, verbal gymnastics, and flat contradictions into which Christian Science writers and lecturers are driven by these authoritative formula which would have excited the envy of an ancient sophist. Words lose all meaning and have to be taken for their prettiness. But I do not intend in this little book to discuss Christian Science literature apart from Miss Eddy. Her formula bind the movement with chains of iron. It is as despotic a dogmatism as that of the popes of the Middle Ages. Mrs. Eddy outdoes the modernists in finding new meanings in old phrases. in defiance of the obvious meaning of those who coined the phrases. But there is one modernist phrase which she never uses: progressive revelation. There is to be no progressive progress about Christian Science. The men of the year 232,711,948 AD will still find all truth in science and health. It is the revelation and the final revelation, and any person who alters a word of it is not a Christian Scientist. The Mussolinis of Boston will soon put him or her over the frontier. 4/5 of Science and Health merely repeat what the other fifth says. All the positive statements in it could have been written on 100 pages instead of 500, but in that case it would have been difficult to charge more than $1 for the book. I should say that the simple statement that spirit alone is real and matter does not exist runs by means of nauseous repetitions to 50 pages of proof. There are not 50 syllables, not one syllable. Variety is afforded by purple passages, badly written, of the kind of verbiage which has no meaning but is very warm and inspiring, and by passages which flagrantly contradict the main thesis. Mrs. Eddy is so vehement that matter does not exist, except as a mental fiction, that she says it about 10,000 times, and then she minutely describes the physical appearance of a cancer of which she claims she cured somebody. This negative statement that matter is unreal is obviously the theoretical basis of the healing, and it is sheer folly. No one can speak or write for 5 minutes and consistently hold that thesis. Where Christian Science does win a good word from some writers is in its positive statement of the dominance of spirit. But before I consider this and its place in the healing and uplifting, let us examine the origin of Christian Science, for it throws a good deal of light on the character of Mrs. Eddy. Should be interesting. Pause for Cottonmouth. And the instrument of inducement of Cottonmouth. It's a vicious circle. All right, chapter 3. Borrowing a revelation. The facts here are so notorious and accessible that some Christian scientists, their authorities, having failed to suppress the documents which give the facts, ask us to see that the character of Mrs. Eddy does not affect the truth of her gospel. It is another little difference from common or garden Christianity. In science, we should admit that an important discovery by a man is not in the least affected by the question whether he was amorous or kleptomaniac, But it has always been understood that it is otherwise in religion. Certainly the ways of God are past finding out, and we mortals cannot lay down our own rules as to the fitness of people for transmitting revelations to the race. There is no reason why God should not see Jack Dempsey or Polinegri. But no doubt the reader will agree with me that the question of the character of Mrs. Eddy has a certain interest, and we will give a chapter to it. The question of the origin of Christian Science concerns the character or the honor of Mrs. Eddy, for this simple reason that she emphatically affirms that she learned from no mortal, but received her truth direct from God, whereas it is held by even such spiritual writers as Dr. Horatio Drescher and Sir W. Barrett, that she got her ideas from a certain man, and lies when she denies that fact. Of course, the word lies is from my own vulgar pen. I forget exactly how they put it, but the facts still suffice. Mary Baker, or Mrs. Eddy as she became, really Mrs. Glover Patterson Eddy, as this ardent despiser of the flesh married 3 times, was certainly a clever woman. She was the daughter of a farmer, and she died worth about $2 million. She educated herself, as one would conclude, and she tells us that she learned with other things, natural philosophy, logic, moral science, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. All of this, the revelation of higher stuff made to her in 1866, seems to have crowded out, except that a reference to the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms, or some other profound piece of natural philosophy, occurs now and again in the Golden Book. In one of the sentences I have quoted occurs the phrase genus homo, a clear proof that she knew Latin, of course. The logic seems to have suffered particularly badly when the burden of the revelation was laid upon her sensitive mind. She married a builder and had a son, and the revelation she communicated so prodigally, does not extend as far as explaining to us why the son was taken from her when he was quite young, and did not see her again until about 30 years later, when she was rich. In 1853, she married a dentist, and he, instead of quitting the planet, quitted her, and left her free to enter upon a spiritual marriage with Asa G. Eddy, who survived it 5 years. Long before this, however, in 1861, Mary, who had very delicate health, heard of a remarkable mind healer named P. Quimby, and she went to Portland in 1862 and 1864 to receive treatments from him. And right here is the issue. Did or did not Mrs. Eddy borrow her revelation from Quimby? It is an interesting question because Quimby died in 1866, and from about 1870 until her death, Mrs. Eddy protested vehemently, even when accused of borrowing from Quimby, that she learned from no one, that the truth was directly revealed to her, and that she invented the name Christian Science for it. There are a few specimens of her innumerable statements. It was after Mr. Quimby's death that I discovered in 1866 the momentous facts relating to mind and its superiority over matter, and named my discovery Christian Science. In the latter half of the 19th century, I discovered the science of Christianity, whence came to me this heavenly conviction, a conviction in antagonism with the testimony of the physical sciences. It was the gift of the grace of God to me. No works on the subject of Christian Science existed prior to my discovery of this science. The discovery and founding of Christian Science has cost more than 30 years of unremitted toil and unrest. In the year 1966, I discovered the Christian Science, or divine laws of life, truth, and love, and named my discovery Christian Science. These protests were made, it must be remembered, in face of the testimony of people who knew quite well her relations with Quimby. There were those who remembered that she had lectured on Quimby's healing system, using Quimby's name, and had in her hands copied his manuscripts. She denied everything except that Quimby had treated her in 1962 and 1964, and that she had from him one short paper which she had herself written. It is now the easiest thing in the world to prove that all her life she lied on that point. She borrowed her system and ideas and practice from Quimby, and merely introduced a few modifications which did not improve it. Quimby, called Dr. Quimby, in the loose fashion of the last century, was a man of poor education, but of thoughtful, brooding disposition, and, at least in later years, high character. He had taken up mesmerism more than 20 years before Miss Eddy met him. Mesmerism and phrenology were the fads of 100 years ago, all over the world, and mesmerism, a crude early form of hypnotism, very easily lent itself to spiritualist speculations. Mesmer himself had held that the medium by means of which one hypnotized the subject was a universal fluid, like ether. But it was in the first half of the 19th century a common belief that the phenomena were were spiritual or due to the action of mind on mind. Quimby began to heal people by mesmerism, using a mesmerized subject to diagnose their ailments. But the material aspect of the phenomena obsessed him more and more, and by 1850 he dropped all ideas of mesmerism and animal magnetism, all physical manipulation of patients, and all drugs. Disease, he concluded, was of mental origin and curable mentally. He did not ask a patient questions or touch him, and he often undertook to care patients at a distance. He was reputed to have healed great numbers of people. But what I am chiefly interested in here is his theory. It was well known that he had left a number of manuscripts, including letters from Mrs. Eddy, but his son refused to have them published. Possibly that very important branch of the Christian Science Executive, the Committee of Publication, which aims to correct or suppress impositions on the public in regard to Christian Science, could tell us why. Quite enough was known, however, to justify any writer in using strong language about Mrs. Eddy. She denied that Quimby cured her, declared that he was a mesmerist and used physical manipulations, and said that she got no part of her gospel from him. But her own letters, newspaper articles, and public lectures and activity from 1862 to 1866 stated that Mrs. Eddy began to write Science and Health in her mother's house, and that she candidly admitted that she owed everything to Quimby's notes and papers. There is no longer room for controversy. Dr. Quimby, the son, died in 1921, and his widow allowed Dr. Horatio Dresser to edit and publish the Quimby manuscripts. The formidable organization of the Light and Love Religion at once turned its attention to their disturbing publication, and the first edition had to be withdrawn. Some very candid letters of Mrs. Eddy to Quimby between 1862 and 1866 had to be omitted. Several letters are given, however. I'm going to make sure I got the right page. Several letters are given, however, and they show Miss Eddy an ardent pupil and admirer of the man whom she afterwards depreciated throughout life. She saw at once that there was money in Quimby's system, and she began to make money out of it immediately. She treated patients herself, and Quimby fortunately preserved the poster of a lecture she gave in 1864. It runs, "Mrs. Patterson will lecture on P. Quimby's spiritual science healing diseases as opposed to deism or Rochester rapping spiritualism." That poster would suffice of itself to show her mendacity. But the few letters of hers to Quimby and the newspaper articles she wrote on him and his system confirmed that she had most carefully studied and adapted Quimby's system, and that it was a practice of spiritual healing, even by absent treatment. As early as 1862, she declared in a newspaper article that Quimby had healed her, which she denied in later years, by persuading her that her disease was a false belief. The words she uses prove that she had most carefully studied his system, and that it is just the system she afterwards claimed to have been revealed to her. The truth which he establishes in his patient cures himself. The body, which is full of light, is no longer in disease. This truth he opposes to the error of giving intelligence to matter and placing pain where it had never placed itself. He heals with the truth Christ taught. Even when the healer died, she was still an ardent Quimbyite, urging the dead man's chief pupil to take up the work. He declined, and Miss Eddy, then Patterson, slowly formed a design of turning the system into a revelation and a religion, working up her copies of Quimby's writings into a Bible of her own, and doing everything in her power to prevent people from knowing what Quimby really taught and wrote. Any person may now read the teachings of Christian Science in the Quimby manuscripts. Even the name Christian Science is there, written years before Mrs. Eddy pretends to have invented that stupid epithet. The only serious improvement in theory made by Mrs. Eddy is to deny the existence of matter altogether. on the wildly illogical ground that since spirit is real, matter must be unreal. One can imagine an exhilarated gentleman arguing that, since the whiskey is real, the water must be unreal. But one cannot understand educated people listening with reverence to such drivel. In practice, of course, Mrs. Eddy transformed the system. It became a religion and a big business. She made $2 million out of it. She organized it on both sides for healing the sick and cheering the melancholy. But we will see a little about her procedure in the next chapter. I will give here a few sentences from Quimby's writing which show that, apart from the denial of the existence of matter, which is the most absurd of her ideas, she got not only the basic thoughts, but all the chief applications of them from the manuscripts written by P. Quimby. And here's the excerpt. Disease is an error of mind. All causation is mental and spiritual. Every man is a part of God, just so far as he is wisdom. God or wisdom is the only reality. All phenomena called disease are the results of false beliefs in the darkness of Egyptian superstition. The realization of the divine ideal is perfect health. All disease is in the mind or belief. To know God is to know ourselves, and this knowledge is Christ or truth. God is not matter, and matter is the only idea that fills no space in wisdom. The eternal word teaches that all matter is, in itself, a shadow. I destroy the disease by showing the error. Disease is the offspring of opinion. Their opinions are what I will try to destroy. Wisdom will destroy the opinion and make the cure. Wow. What a load. Twiddle. Okay. Cottonmouth. Induce more cottonmouth. Okay. 22 minutes. All right. Now, back to the reading. We have here even the germ of the idea that mind is unreal, and all the other ideas of Christian science are explicit. Disease is a false belief, human nature is pure, healthy and divine, and has only to realize it. Christ is God only in the same sense as, though in a higher degree than, other men. Even the verbiage of the Quimby manuscripts coincides in very large part with that of science and health, and for the good reason, that as unexceptionally witnesses have testified, Mrs. Eddy's stuff is taken from the manuscripts she had copied. She was, however, a fluent, if a wretched writer, and soon she could pour out frothy streams of the same type of verbiage on her own account. But every fundamental idea is in Quimby, except that the idea of matter as a mere shadow is not pushed to logical extremes. Even in this, however, it is not true that, as some writers say, Mrs. Eddy was quite original. Mrs. Eddy's story for the next few years confirms both this view of her character and her complete indebtedness to Quimby. Down to almost 1870, she was simply a Quimby healer and lecturer. Nearly every statement she made about that period has been disproved, and the supernatural halo which she has put upon those adventurous days is disgusting. She was not beyond medical treatment when she went to Quimby, and she was not cured. Her doctor has contemptuously denied her statements. She was a neuroptic and had in earlier life been hysterical. Her father, referring to the legendary person in the Bible who had 7 devils, had said, "Our Mary has 10 devils." She had all her life a vile temper, and her second husband, Patterson, left her in disgust. Her later statement, that he went off with another woman is false. The latest book on her, apart from the monotonous verbiage periodically put out by her followers, is Sir W. Barrett's Religion of Health. Barrett was a strong spiritualist, and although he is compelled to admit that Mrs. Eddy's greed for money, temper, arrogance, self-praise, and untruthful statements about the origin of her system make her personal character repellent, he so greatly appreciates the glorifications of spirit in her system that he leniently ignores a good deal that ought to be told the reader about her earlier years. A far better book is Mr. J. Moffat Logan's Christian Science Expounded and Exposed, 1923. This cheap, exhaustive, and moderate book, critically selecting from the older antagonistic literature, besides showing a close personal study, is really the best impartial work on Christian Science now current, but it is a British book, and I presume the Christian Scientists have got it kept out of circulation in America. Mr. Moffat tells in detail an amazing story of the years after 1964, when, according to Mrs. Eddy, God was slowly guiding her toward the great revelation. Patterson left her in 1866, and she chiefly earned her living going from place to place as the chief heiress of Quimby's system of healing. For some time she was intimately associated, at Lynn, with a male adventurer who called himself Dr. Kennedy. She charged $100 for 12 lessons on Quimby's system, but as pupils increased, she was impelled by God to put the price up to $300, and later to reduce the number of lectures to 7. Kennedy paid the expenses. In 1872, her quarrels with him culminated in a separation, and she began to entertain the wonderful plan of forming a movement or religion of her own, using her own Bible and despotically governed and exploited by herself. All this, as I said, Mrs. Eddy had buried under the romantic statements of her autobiography and other writings. She learned nothing from Quimby. She began to see the truth in 1866, when she instantly cured herself after an accident. She did a certain amount of instantaneous healing, but soon withdrew to meditate on the scriptures and find the science of mind for about 3 years. During these years, she was making the $6,000 which she had when she parted from Kennedy, and was laboriously putting together fragments of Quimby's writings. When this task was completed, she represented the results of her scissors and paste work as the divine revelation directly communicated to her. Peabody, in his Eddyism, quotes her own words. I should blush to write of science and health, with key to the scriptures, as I have, were it of human origin, and I apart from God, its author, but as I was only a scribe echoing the harmonies of heaven and divine metaphysics, I cannot be super modest of the Christian Science textbook. The one thing, apart from the capacity to write decent English, which Miss Eddy could not do, was to blush. Sir W. Barrett quotes some words of hers in which she modestly depreciates the placing of herself on a level with Christ. But Peabody shows that she at other times encouraged the practice, and in her miscellaneous writings she always says, "We shall claim no special gift from our divine origin." She openly encouraged the idea of her sillier admirers that she was the successor and equal of Jesus Christ. As Mark Twain ironically observes, Christian Science shop sells the Word of God for 15 cents, but for the cheapest edition of the Word of Mary, they charge $3.18. And that is the end of chapter 5. No, chapter 3. Chapter 3. And I think I'm going to end it there. And I will see you again in part 3 of Little Blue Book number 354, titled The Absurdities of Christian Science, written by Joseph McCade, copyright sometime in the 20s. Thanks for listening. and I'll see